to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Christian Apologist, Brian Keith Bowen. And we're here again for another exciting debate review. This is the fifth part and fifth installment to the debate review that I've been doing between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McLatchie on Unbelievable. Again, full disclosure. I've got permission from James Coons to do this debate review. He's opened the door for me to other debate reviews on this channel, which I really appreciated. So I'm glad he did that. He opened that door because I like watching these kinds of debates. Of course, James does a lot of things that's beyond the scope of, or does a lot of debates that are beyond the scope of this channel. But the religious debates he does is within the scope of this channel, and that's what I would end up focusing on. And of course, I would love to hear what you think in the comment section. What do you think I should do more reviews like this? That would be awesome. I am doing. This is supposed to be the final part to the series, and it might be a decently long video because when I did the notes on this, I was doing the closing argument and the Q&A. The closing arguments ain't very long, but the Q&A went a lot longer than I anticipated. Actually got quite a bit of notes, and hopefully it won't be as long as video 3 of the series was. I don't plan on making it that long. I'm gonna do a lot of editing. I'm gonna edit all the irrelevant stuff out. There's some Q&A stuff. There's some banter back and forth. I mean, there's some stuff in there that I can edit out in the editing. This is not any disrespect to modern day debate or Matt Dillahunty or Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. I'm just doing it for time reasons because otherwise this is going to be a very long video like video 3, and I'm going to try to edit that out so it's not as long of a video. The closing session of this debate, I will be giving my closing argument, or not really an argument, or more like what I think who won the debate and the reasons why I think they won. You probably already know who I think won the debate and who I think lost, but I want to make sure you understand the reasons why, because a lot of people had mixed feelings about the debate. Of course, all the atheists thought Matt won, all the Christians thought that Jonathan won, and so I want to understand that my evaluation has nothing to do with the fact that Jonathan is a Christian and Matt Dillahunty is an atheist. That's not the reason why I made my assessment. My assessment is based solely upon the arguments, and I will tell you in the closing session, I will tell you what my reasons are for saying this person lost and this person won, and why I thought this argument was stronger than this argument, and why, and that way. So you understand that it has nothing to do with whose worldview is what and what my worldview just happened to be, and that has nothing to do with my assessment. It is purely because of the arguments, which is where it should be. It should be on the arguments. That's where where we should keep our focus on. All right. Without further ado, let's dive right in. And we're back. All right. All right. So one of the things I did to shorten down the time, I'm not going to do Matt or Jonathan McLatchie's closing argument. The reason is because it's basically a summary of his overall argument we already heard, and by and large, I agree with him. There is one factor he does put in the argument that will be relevant to what Matt is fixing to do. Matt had said, just got through saying that before the closing arguments had started, I didn't show that, but before the closing arguments had started, he said that he was going to pretty much forfeit his closing, because he'd be willing to go directly to Q&A afterwards, and Jonathan can do a closing if he wanted to, but Jonathan wanted to do a closing, so he did a closing. And then right after Jonathan got to his closing, Matt's fixing to speak up and says he's going to make himself a liar. He basically turned his closing argument into a rebuttal, and you'll see that in a minute, which I thought was very unfair. This is no reference to James at all. I understand James was just allowing them to, go at it, do their thing. But I don't think that Matt should have done this. An unspoken rule in debating is that you don't add anything new in your closing argument. Your closing argument is not a rebuttal. Okay? It's not a rebuttal. He turns his closing argument into a second rebuttal, which Jonathan can't respond to because Jonathan can't respond to his closing. And Jonathan didn't bring up anything new in his closing. He accused him of not understanding an inductive argument even before that. Remember, he accused him of that toward the end of the crossfire section. He accused him of that, and Matt started getting mad about that. So Jonathan didn't bring up anything new, but Matt sat there and jumped on that and turned his closing argument into a rebuttal that Jonathan did not have a chance to respond to, which I thought was very, very unfair and very unethical of Matt to do. I'm not accusing him of anything bad per se. I'm not, it's nothing criminal or nothing. But in a debate, you don't do that. It's even if it's not spoken in a rule, you just kind of understand that you don't do that because it's not fair to the other person. And so there's a fairness issue at stake there because Matt decided to do it anyway. Granted, he can get a closing argument, but he wasn't trying to get a closing argument. Rather, he was trying to get another rebuttal to rebut him. So he can get the last word in and try to rebut him. And Jonathan couldn't even respond to it because it's the closing arguments. At least it was supposed to be a closing argument. But Matt treated his closing argument like a rebuttal. And so that's where we are right now. Jonathan just got through with his closing argument. And like I said, by and large, I agree with Jonathan. Pretty much a summary of his case. Now we're going to hear from Matt, and we're going to see what Matt did in turning the argument into a rebuttal. All right, let's do this.
And I'm going to turn myself into a liar and take 10 seconds or 15 seconds because I just got accused of not understanding induction by somebody who doesn't understand induction. And during his closing remarks, he mentioned, first of all, that he believes his sources are trustworthy because of the credibility of witnesses. The credibility of the witnesses is evidence for the proposition that the witness is trustworthy. That is the evidence you're leaning on, not the claim. What about?
I've already mentioned this before, but I'll get to his statement about induction in a minute because he's about to make a really weird statement about abductive reasoning, and we'll get to that in a second. And when we do that, then I'll talk about inductive argument. I just don't want to have to repeat myself. All right. Testimony does count as evidence. We already talked about this, but you can. Historians speak of what's called supporting evidence. Supporting evidence is basically additional evidence that you have that can support other evidences or facts. So, more supporting evidence you have, the stronger the supporting evidence you have, the stronger the piece of evidence that it's supporting. So, but this doesn't mean that testimony itself does not count as evidence. It's still evidence. So Matt is just, again, barking up the wrong tree. Testimony is evidence. Trying to claim that claims aren't evidence is a fallacy in logic. It's existential fallacy. It is flawed reasoning. We've already talked about that. It's also self-refuting because it in itself is a claim. And if claims can't count as evidence, and you have to, and even if you try to claim that the claim can't count as sufficient enough evidence to rise to convince, well, that's still self-refuting because then I'm not convinced because his claims can't rise to the level of convincing that claims are evidence. So it becomes a completely self-refuting argument, even if he tries to revert back to the other. Now, of course, my main argument on claim not evidence is centered in that argument, but he'll bounce back to the other one and think it's not sufficient. Okay. Even if he goes back to the other argument, it would still be a self-refuting argument. It would still be a self-refuting argument. And of course, it's factually inaccurate. Testimony has always been considered as evidence. A testimony, a person testifies that something's true. And also, this is different from a mere assertion, but I'm not going to get into that right now because he will make a mere assertion during the, I think, the Q&A. All right, let's continue.
Best explains that claim. When you said that, you said it a minute ago. You're looking for what best explains that situation. That's not an inductive argument. That's an abductive argument, which is the weakest form of argument, not the strongest. If you're going to suggest that I don't understand inductive argument when I pointed out that I did, and I've taught on this stuff before, well, you're actually making an abductive argument that is not the strongest. And then trying to claim that claims are evidence. Well, if claims are in fact evidence, then I will claim that claims aren't evidence. And you'll have to accept this under your epistemology that as evidence against your claim.
All right. I'm going to target that last part that he said first, and then I'll get to inductive. Because you notice how he just flipped that on his head, right? He's making it look like Jonathan is the one doing the self-refuting argument. The problem, however, is that Jonathan's not the one doing the self-refuting argument. The difference is that Jonathan is saying that some types of claims, such as testimonial claims, can count as evidence, and that the term claim is a much broader term, and it's in its complexity, and could involve different kinds of claims, and specific kinds of claims, such as testimonies, can count as evidence. That is Jonathan's argument. He's not arguing that all claims count as evidence. He's arguing that certain types of claims can count as evidence. Matt's argument, also, excuse me, I still have bits and pieces of cold that I just came off of. I just coughing, but it might be a distraction a bit. All right. As far as Matt's argument, he's claiming that no claim can count as evidence. Or if he bounces another one, he thinks it's not sufficient enough to rise to the level of convincing. But he'll still argue most of the time, the vast majority of the time, that it don't count as evidence. Except a type of claim can count as evidence. Some claims can count as evidence. When he says that all testimonies are claims and all claims count as evidence, he is committing the existential fallacy, because he has to recognize a specific type of claim, and then he's using universal language to generalize that to all types of claims. And this is called the existential fallacy, and he's making that here. Jonathan isn't making that. Jonathan isn't making the existential fallacy because he recognizes that not all claims will count as evidence, but certain types of claims, specifically testimony, which is what we're actually discussing here, counts as evidence. And of course, Matt is making a self-refuting argument because he's using universal language. He thinks all claims don't count as evidence and all testimony are claims. Therefore, he thinks that certain types of claims, such as testimonial claims, cannot count as evidence, which is the existential fallacy. Jonathan, however, is not doing that. And it also is the reason why Jonathan's argument is not self-refuting, because he's not claiming that all claims are evidence. And by the way, another thing is that Matt is still assuming that being evidence guarantees the proposition. Nobody, including Jonathan, he said it multiple times in this debate, he does not think it guarantees the proposition. It supports it. That's actually the role that evidence plays. It supports the proposition. It supports the conclusion. It's not that it guarantees it. It's that it supports it. And the stronger the evidence, the more the evidence we have, all of this increases the probability that the proposition in question, the conclusion in question, is true. And sitting there saying, oh, no, it isn't, doesn't really demonstrate anything. So yes, Jonathan is not making the existential fallacy. Jonathan is not making a self-refuting argument. Is Matt making a self-refuting argument? Now, let's talk about inductive reasoning. Okay. What are these? Inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning. All right. A inductive argument argues from particulars to particulars or particulars to generalities. Okay, that's an inductive argument. A deductive argument, that's the argument that I use. A deductive argument argues from generalities to generalities or generalities to particulars. All right. A lot of times you see people like, Gary Habermas or Mike Licona use, and I do as well, and William Craig does this as well. We'll use a series of facts, and then those facts would lead to that conclusion. That is a deductive argument because they're going from generalities to particulars, or generalities to generalities, whichever the case. That's called a deductive argument. Inductive argument doesn't do that. Inductive argument does the opposite. It goes from particulars to generalities or particulars to particulars. Okay. And what Matt is doing is he keeps saying, okay, just because this is true don't mean that's true, and that's not what he's arguing for. He'll say things like, just because this over here is true doesn't mean Jesus rose again from the dead. As if Jonathan's trying to prove Jesus rose again with that one particular, and he's just trying to prove this particular. And so he doesn't understand an inductive argument, or at least it seems like he doesn't. I'm willing to give Matt the benefit of the doubt and say if you ask Matt to define an inductive argument, maybe he can give you the correct definition, possibly. But in this debate, in the course of his arguments, it appears like he doesn't understand it. But I think his issue is maybe he doesn't understand or quite get a cumulative case. All resurrection arguments are cumulative case. In a cumulative case, each fact builds upon other facts. So once you got all these facts, once you got all this evidence, and it's the totality effect, it's the cumulative effect of all that evidence, of all that data, that points directly to the conclusion. It is not one particular fact. It's not one particular piece of evidence. It's not one particular piece of data that points to it. But what Matt likes to do, he likes to take a piece of data out, a piece of a data point, a piece of evidence, a particular fact that you are supporting with evidence, and say, yes, even if that's true, Jesus didn't rise again from the dead. As if you're trying to prove it with that one piece of data. That's like a pet peeve of mine, personally. Because when someone does that to a cumulative case, it kind of makes me want to say, I mean, don't you understand a cumulative case? I'm not trying to prove that Jesus rose again with that one fact, because if I tried to prove Jesus rose again for that one fact, I wouldn't need the other facts. So it doesn't make no sense. Obviously, I need the other facts. I need the other data. I'm using the other data. I'm using the other facts. I'm using the other evidences. So obviously, I do need those things, and those things are required together to prove the conclusion at hand. I'm not trying to prove the conclusion by that one piece of evidence or that one piece of fact or whatever, or an individual fact. But Matt acts as though that's exactly what you're trying to do, and you're not. So I don't know if he quite gets a cumulative argument. But it appears on the surface like he doesn't understand an inductive argument, and that's why Jonathan attacked that. Now, what about this thing about abductive reasoning? Okay, let me explain what abductive reasoning is. Abductive reasoning is going from what you know, to the best explanation of what you know. So it's basically making inferences off of things that you might know. Okay. Now, of course, deductive and inductive might use abductive reasoning from time to time, but they're obviously separate. The biggest thing, though, is when Matt says, okay, first of all, Jonathan's not making an abductive argument. He is making an inductive argument. I just explained to you the definition of an inductive argument. He's clearly making an inductive argument. He's not making an abductive argument. But what is this thing about Matt saying abductive reasoning is the weakest form of reasoning or weakest form of argument? That's false. That's 100% false. Deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning are just categories of reasoning. They're not, of course, they could always have strong and weak arguments within them. Like someone could argue abductively weak with a weak argument, or abductively strong argument. And same thing with deductive argument, same thing with inductive argument. That's true of any of the categories, but the categories themselves by nature are not weak, are naturally weak or weaker than the other argument. They're just different forms of reasoning. Um, and let me explain something. Police detectives use abductive reasoning. In fact, J. Warner Wallace, who's a very famous cold case detective, said in an interview that this is that detectives have to have abductive reasoning to be able to do their detective thing and solve cases. That's going from what you know and making inferences from what you know, and there's nothing unreasonable about it. Doctors, medical doctors, use abductive reasoning when they're assessing symptoms. Yeah, that's what they use. It's abductive reasoning. And get this, we use abductive reasoning on a regular basis. Every time we make a decision, we're using abductive reasoning. It is a regular form of reasoning, in fact, because we use it all the time. In fact, Matt, in debate with the guy that does inspiring philosophy, I think his name might be John Jones. I can't remember. But he does inspiring philosophy on YouTube. And he was in the debate with him on Unbelievable. And in that debate, Matt even argued abductively. Would he call his argument weak at the time? Probably not. But yeah, abductive reasoning is not the weakest form of argument. It's just a category of reasoning. Well, anyway, Doc is not making an abductive argument, but clearly Matt is really confusing the pot from people that don't know philosophy and never study reasoning. Yeah, that's that. Yeah. All right, let's move on from this.
I'm done.
All right, it's going to get to the Q&A now. We'll go to that.
We'll jump into those questions, folks. Thanks so much, Jonathan and Matt, for those closings, and we are going to go to the next one. This one was from Justin Maher, PhD in Pine Creek Studies. I can't remember. I don't think we read this. Saving this one for you, Jonathan. They said, if the martyrdom claims are the best evidence that the apostles weren't lying, then what is the second best evidence that they weren't lying? And is lying more likely than miracles?
The last question was asked was about whether or not it's more likely that someone was lying. And I just wanted to add in my note that I'm not in any way claiming that somebody's lying. However, lying would be more likely than accurately reporting a miracle. Anyway, so.
Of course, Matt is assuming his worldview, actually. Of course, we have to look at the evidence anyway. And that's something that Matt just has a tendency to ignore. Matt, of course, will not take a position that he thinks that someone's being intentionally deceptive.
So yeah, I don't know that. I don't know if we're going to get to this other question, but I know a question in chat that I wanted to address really quickly. Somebody asked why I have a different standard for the Bible than I would for any other historical book, and the answer is I don't. Any other historical book that was making claims about supernatural events, I would reject those as well.
Gotcha.
Yes, he does have double standards. Okay, to start with, he has his worldview on the sleeve. I mean, he's assuming his worldview. You just basically heard him assuming that in his argument. Any other book that claims miracles, I will reject that too. In other words, he's assuming miracles don't happen. Other books claim miracles, therefore it must be wrong. That's his argument basically. Just in. Of course, it's just a flawed assumption. It's assuming his worldview in the first place. I wonder what he would think about most ancient biographies that just happen to have miracles in them, because most ancient biographies have miracles in them. Would he reject those too? According to him, he would. And he's not consistent. In his debate with Mike Licona, he said that he does not think that rejection of testimony would lead him to rejecting everything in history, but it would, because if taken consistently. So yeah. Now he's more consistent than Barman, because Barman would make a lot of bad arguments and debates and then turn around and take stuff as sources, or like I question whether all these people wrote all these books, and 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 Plutarch and that sort of thing, and then he'll sit there and identify Plutarch says this or Plutarch says that. Yeah. So Matt's a little bit more consistent than that, but he's not consistent either. He will not consistently hold to a position, and he does have double standards. In fact, all skeptics have double standards with the New Testament. The reality is that they assume things about the New Testament, and they will not hold the same standard fully, at least, with other works of ancient history, with other works of antiquity. They won't hold the same standard to it. They might for miracles because of their anti-supernatural worldview, but they're not going to with a historical liability of it. They just won't.
Gotcha. Natural Legion, thanks for your question. Said, Jonathan, you invoked Luke's reliability as a historian. By that standard, shouldn't we believe miracles of Greek mythology documented by Herodotus?
Well, let me let him answer real quick, and then I'm gonna give you my response to that.
No, we'd have to look at the evidence. And just the fact that miracles using another source doesn't necessarily provide good evidential support for that miracle claim. You have to look at the particulars. And I think that in the case of the resurrection, the particulars are well substantiated for the reasons I gave, among others.
All right. Let me explain something about Herodotus. Herodotus does mention miracles in his works, and I've read this in his works. When he does mention miracles, he does so letting you know that he is questioning the source. He's questioning whether it happened. A lot of times he will stress he doesn't think it happened. It's just stories that he heard or picked up, things of that nature. For the Gospels to equate to Herodotus, it'll be equivalent to if the Gospels reported that Jesus did miracles, but then question whether he actually did them or not, or that the sources are very highly questionable, or we don't really know if he really did this. That would be a true equate to what Herodotus did. Herodotus never said, "Oh, I agree that they did these things." He actually questioned the sources. He questioned whether they actually happened. He said, oh, "Okay, this is what some people were saying, but yeah, I don't think it's very credible." So I don't really find that to be a truly equal analogy or example that would equal to the gospel situation, because in the gospel accounts, gospel writers do present them as true history and that they actually happened. In the case of Herodotus, he's picking up these stories. He tells us he's picking up these stories, and he questions the source. He questions whether the miracles actually happen. So yeah. So even though skeptics might bring up Herodotus, it makes me wonder if they actually read Herodotus, because Herodotus actually don't think any of these miracles that he's picking up from other people actually happened. And of course, I agree with Jonathan about looking at the particulars of the case, look at the specifics. It's not just simply, again, Jonathan is not condoning, supporting, or defending total gullibility. Matt, throughout this debate, treated Jonathan like that's what he was doing, but he was not. He was not. The charge of double standards often does that. It just assumes that you're assuming that these things should be taken at face value, no supporting evidence, no other evidence available. Just take them at their word. Why don't you take these other things at their word too? Even if they're testimonies hundreds of years later, even if they're coming from questionable sources and things of that nature. So we have to look at the particulars of the case. We have to look at the specifics.
Gotcha. And thank you for your question. This one comes in from Brandon Holbrook. Says, is there any verifiable extra biblical evidence supporting the resurrection?
No, I don't think so.
Gotcha.
That's a good question.
Roy Segal.
All right. Extra biblical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. This will also come up later in this Q&A by Matt. Extra biblical evidence. All right. first of all, there's actually is extra biblical evidence. Now there's extra biblical evidence of the testimony, because that's all you're going to have. It's going to have extra biblical evidence. It's going to be of what is, people saying, hey, I saw Jesus. That's basically what you're going to have extra biblical evidence of. But Josephus mentions it. The passage is disputed because there's some interpolations involved in there, but that doesn't mean it was completely inserted. It just means it was doctored or something later on down the road in the manuscripts. But an early, I think it's 3rd century Aramaic version, or either Arabic or Aramaic version of Josephus was believed to record the actual words of it. But basically, the statement is simply that there were people claiming that Jesus rose again from the dead. And of course, Josephus is 1st century. Tacitus also mentions it. He references it as the most mischievous superstition. After he talks about Jesus' crucifixion, he said that Christus, which is Latin for Christ, whom the name Christian has its origins, he said, suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius Caesar. That's Jesus' crucifixion. He said that he said after this, he said, was checked for the moment, but then it broke out again in Judea. In other words, he said right after this, it was okay. And then shortly thereafter, he says it broke out again in Judea. He says most mischievous superstition. He said, because pagans didn't believe in a physical resurrected person. They believe in disembodied spirits. And so to Tacitus' ears, in his worldview, he would think this is a mischievous superstition. Something that caused a lot of chaos, and he didn't think that it was true, but he says that, it happened. And he said it broke out again in Judea, the first source of the evil. In other words, that's the source. That's the origin of the source. And of course, this is a pagan, hostile source too. So we got 2 non-Christian sources outside of the New Testament that references the testimony of the disciples. Now, with that said, I want to point to 1 Corinthians 15, Creed, because first in their book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, Gary Habermas and Mike Licona actually identify the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed as both biblical and extra biblical. And they're right. It's biblical in the sense that it appears in the letter of 1 Corinthians. So obviously, Matt's not going to consider this to be extra biblical, because he thinks, it's appeared in the letter of Paul in 1 Corinthians. But the creed itself, this is the part that we're trying to get skeptics to understand. Paul didn't put this creed there, or Paul didn't originate this creed here. The creed didn't originate when Paul penned it in the letter to the Corinthians. This has non-Pauline terms. Paul saying that he passed on that which he received. This is creed. It's in creedal form, short, long line parallelisms. And so we know it's a creed. We know it goes back early. James and Peter are mentioned by name in the creed. I already talked about this in a previous video. And we can trace it back to the Mary Malcolm disciples, to a meeting that he had within 3 years of his conversion, within less than 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. So we're talking about a very early creed. And this creed didn't originate with Paul, but it was given to Paul. And so this is biblical in the sense of appearing in 1 Corinthians 15. It's extra biblical in the sense that this did not originate in the letter that Paul is writing. Rather, it originated outside of that letter. Therefore, it does count as extra biblical evidence in that sense. Now, of course, Matt would never consider this extra biblical evidence, but it is considered extra biblical because it does not originate with 1 Corinthians. So that's interesting too. But let's continue.
Oh, let's see. This one might be easy too. I think you covered this already, Jonathan, but we'll give just in case. Roy asks, if it could be shown to your satisfaction that the resurrection didn't happen, would you still be a Christian, Jonathan?
Absolutely not. As I said at the beginning, I'm a very staunch evidentialist. So I believe in the gospel because and only because I am persuaded by the public evidence Christianity is true. And in principle, I would be prepared to change my mind on that conclusion if the evidence were to flow the other direction.
All right. Matt's fixing to chime in there for a second, but I'm going to let you know, I'm not an evidentialist. I'm a cumulative-based Christian apologist, but my mind is very evidential based. I need evidence. I need reasons for justifying what I believe, and to believe that what I believe is a sound, reason to believe. It's not just simply. This is why I'm always appalled at someone calling my beliefs irrational. I didn't arrive at my beliefs irrationally. I rose to my belief from a rational perspective. If Jesus rose again from the dead, then this would verify a lot of things, including the existence of God. Christianity is true no matter what, if Jesus is risen from the dead, regardless of what you might think about the Bible or whatnot. And obviously, if Jesus had not risen from the dead, I would not be a Christian today. I could not maintain Christianity if its most founding, most foundational, most fundamental doctrine in our belief system was false. And you could demonstrate that that's false, not just simply assert it, not just simply be convinced of it, but rather that it was false, and you could demonstrate that it's false through evidence. I would not be able to be a Christian today. However, the evidence is very strong to support it. Now, with that said, I will not. With that said, on this, I don't think if there was evidence for Jesus' resurrection not being true, I would not be a Christian today. But I don't believe that after so long of studying this matter and having such good arguments in favor of Jesus' resurrection, I do not think that we're going to discover some bombshell evidence that's just going to just really rock the Christian faith or something of that nature. I think that because if Jesus did, if we have strong evidence, as we believe we have, for Jesus' resurrection, then we're never going to find some sort of piece of evidence that's going to show Christianity to be false or show that Jesus didn't rise again from the dead, because we have strong evidence that he did. Now, we had that evidence. And so I personally don't think I would change my view if there was strong evidence against Jesus' resurrection. But I don't think that after years of doing this and having such a very powerful case for Jesus' resurrection, I don't think we're going to find any at this point. And I think it's pretty much a done deal that Jesus rose again from the dead based on the evidence. All right. Let's continue. Matt's going to chime in there on that question.
What evidence could ever possibly be presented that the resurrection didn't happen?
That's a great question. I've been asked this quite a bit. And the examples I've normally given and have been presented to you in some of your other debates would be that if you were to find the body of Jesus or something like that. And I get why atheists find that answer quite frustrating, because that in principle, yes, that would falsify Christianity. But how would you ever demonstrate the body of Jesus, right?
Well, we found a body.
Yeah. So I completely agree with you. However, if the arguments that I think support the resurrection turned out in the fullness of time not to be as strong as I thought they were, then that would reduce my confidence correspondingly in resurrection. And I think, in principle, you could make an argument Jesus didn't exist. I mean, Richard Carrier and Bob Price and David Fitzgerald and others have tried to mount that argument. I don't think it works, but in principle, I think you could make such an argument.
I don't think it works either.
Cool.
You and I are in agreement there. I think the one thing is, what if?
All right. Before we keep going there, all right. What would convince me that Jesus didn't rise again from the dead? Like Jonathan, it probably wouldn't be one specific thing. It probably a number of things, number of items. Like if you found the bones of Jesus and you could tell it was crucified. We could tell someone was crucified because we've got a Jew that had been crucified before AD 70 And he has the marks of crucifixion that matches historically. He had a nail, about this big, pretty big nail. It was in his ankle, and that was found. And legs was found broke. Uh, and this is 2,000 years later, but we can still tell that the guy got crucified. So, if we found that indicative of those kinds of markings, the person was definitely crucified. That maybe we could match the blood, or DNA with the blood of the child of Turin, or something of that nature. But the objective, of course, is that we have to. It probably wouldn't be just one piece of evidence. It'd have to be lots of different factors that fall and get together. But I think it gets a little bit more complicated than that. Let me elaborate more than what Jonathan did here. Yes, it would be that I would look at specific evidences, and that evidences would, pile up or whatnot. But it will also be that you'd have to show that my evidence that convinced me in the first place that Jesus rose again from the dead wasn't as strong as I thought. See, it's basically got two different factors at work. One is to show that the evidence that I present is not as strong that convinced me that Jesus rose again from the dead isn't as strong as I think. And two would be to find evidence that would falsify the conclusion. Such as finding the body of Jesus, the bones of Jesus, and it's indicative of crucifixion marks, and and that sort of thing, and they could test it and figure out that it's reliable, it's not a hoax or something of that nature. Combined with them being able to undermine the case for the resurrection, I've not seen anybody able to undermine the credibility of the resurrection. Yeah. I doubt if it will ever come. All right. All right, let's continue.
But if it could be shown that to the extent to which you're convinced that the Bible's account of the resurrection is accurate, would force you into accepting other religious claims as well if you were to use the same standard of evidence.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Whatever standard of evidence you've, whatever epistemological foundation you've got that leads you to the conclusion that the reports in the Bible are reliably strong evidence for a resurrection, if it could be shown that if you applied that standard to other religious claims as well, you would be forced to accept them, would that change your mind?
Yes, it would. That would significantly under.
Let me see if I can understand what Matt is basically arguing at. The same standard. Okay, if I apply the same standard, and I have, because I actually study other religions. I've got books on my shelf on other religions. If I apply the same standard as applying here to other religions, and I have, would I change my mind? Well, truth is, I wouldn't, because the evidence is stacked against these other religions. Matt has a underlying assumption. It doesn't come out very well in this question because he's trying to ask a point blank question. Well, if you accept this over here, then wouldn't you have to accept this over here? So you have to reject that over there. So if you have to accept these other claims, then would you reject that? That's ultimately what he's doing. He's got an underlying assumption there, namely that the evidence for the resurrection is no different from these other claims, these other testimonies. Here's the problem with that. All right, let's say the Quran. The Quran is 600. It's mostly about Jesus, but it's 600 years later after Jesus existed. 600 years. The New Testament is written in the first century, and the Resurrection Proclamation can be traced right within less than a couple years of the event. And what Matt is ultimately asking us, if I trust the testimony that's within less than a couple years of the event, then I must trust this testimony here by the Quran, which is 600 years later. It doesn't make any sense, because If I apply the same standard that I'm applying here with the New Testament, is the same standard, I would reject the Quran, because the Quran is not meeting that standard. That was one of the problems with Anand Agarwal. If you watch my debate review with Anand Agarwal of my debate with him, and you notice he kept trying to accuse me of double standards. He kept making slippery slope fallacy and stuff like that, and Matt does as well, where if you accept one, you must accept all these others, and that's not the case, because we can have different reasons for accepting one and rejecting another. And of course, the same standard I'm using to accept the New Testament, I would have to reject the other testimonies. Because if I'm accepting the testimony of the disciples because they're early, because they're reliable, because the evidence is against them lying about it, and because I can trace this information right back to the mouth of the disciples, but then why would I trust the testimony that's 600 years later? By the same standard, I would have to reject the other testimony. It isn't a different standard, it's the same standard. It just, the Quran isn't meeting that standard. Same thing with Buddhism, it's 500 years later. That's the same thing with the miracle claims of Philostratus's work, Life of Apollonius, which is over 100 years after Apollonius of Tyana lived. It's the earliest source we have on Apollonius of Tyana, and it's dated to early 3rd century or early to mid 3rd century. So it's like over 100 years later. And, why would I trust that? Some people say, well, don't you trust Muhammad said to go on a winged horse. Now you got to believe that. Well, that comes from Muhammad's biography, which is 125 to 150 years after he lived. Why would I trust that if I trust the New Testament, the testimony of the New Testament, which is within a couple of years, that we could trace back to the mouth of the disciples? We don't even know if that's even anything even come close to what Muhammad had happened to Muhammad. It's 150 years later. Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense, because the reality of it is that the same standard which would lead me to accept the resurrection proclamation in the New Testament would also lead me to reject other religions. So I understand why Matt or Jonathan answered the way he did, but I reject the underlying assumption that Matt clearly has, because that's just not the case. Of course, it's slippery slope fallacy too. Again, if A, then B, then C, then D. No, you don't have to accept other religious claims solely because it's there. We're not accepting New Testament claims just solely because it's there. We're looking at other data. We're looking at other evidences. We're looking at supporting evidences. We're looking at all those things. And the same, the weight, the kind of evidence that the New Testament has, I can't find with other religious claims. So I don't see the comparison. I reject its underlying assumption there.
My confidence, yeah, and typically, I tend to think of worldviews in very similar terms to scientific paradigm or scientific theory. That all scientific theories have anomalous data, but you don't just throw out the whole paradigm to give some anomalous data. Over time, that anomalous data accumulates, and if you have enough anomalous data that builds a bigger paradigm, eventually you're going to think, okay, this paradigm might actually be false. And likewise with Christianity, although there are some extreme examples I could think of, in practice, I think that it wouldn't be a single piece of extraordinary evidence that would change my mind, but it would be the cumulative effect of many pieces of independent evidence pointing against Christianity, which in the long run, I think would be sufficient to change my mind.
But now you're back to cumulative evidence. All I was talking about was if it was shown that your foundation, your reasoning, would force you to accept others as well, and you said yes, you'd accept it. Now that is fundamentally the exact question that I asked repeatedly before you left that you never answered. How can you write off these other claims from religion when they are just accounts as well? They don't have, it's not like Christianity has some extra physical evidence for it. It's just, here's a bunch of accounts, and here's a bunch of accounts, and you're dismissing others What is the standard that makes you accept one and reject another?
All right. First of all, the reason why Jonathan didn't fully answer Matt's question is because he was trying to answer it. He was trying to explain. He actually answered it. He said, "Yeah, I would reject them," and he was trying to explain why he would reject them. And Matt kept interrupting and just jumping to the assumption that he's talking about total gullibility when he wasn't, and before he left and that sort of thing. So it's really because of Matt's doing. But all right. He said they're just counts too. There's no. It's not like there's physical evidence. Just because there's no physical evidence doesn't mean it's not true. We would have to reject the vast majority of history if that's the case, because the vast majority of what we know about the past comes from literary documentary sources all the way up to the present, by the way, unless it happened in our own lifetimes, like the 9/11 incident. We would have to sit there and rely on documentary literary sources. That's where we get the vast majority of our historical knowledge. You obviously don't need physical evidence just because you don't need physical evidence to prove something or have evidence. You can still have historical sources as evidence, which is what's necessary. And by the way, the New Testament actually has quite a bit of physical evidence behind it, archaeology as well as Old Testament, but that's irrelevant because at the end of the day, the sources themselves can count as evidence. They use scholarly criteria, control methods, and things like that to evaluate and examine the sources of information. And so they're not. It's not just that there are counts, and that's what Matt keeps missing this point. He says he agrees with it, but then he misses the point that Jonathan's trying to make completely. Jonathan's trying to make the point that we're not just gullible. We're not supporting total gullibility. We're not saying, hey, the testimony of the disciples said this, let's take it. We have no other reasons to believe that they're telling the truth, but let's just go with it anyhow. That's not what Jonathan's arguing. In fact, Jonathan hasn't argued that in the entire debate. He's explicitly said we have to look at the particulars of the case. We have to look at the specifics. We have to look at whether they're likely to lie or whether they have inaccurate information, how accurate is the source, how reliable it is, where's this information coming from, those kinds of things. And Matt just writes it off like Jonathan saying, let's be gullible. Let's just accept what they say. And if you accept what they say, you should accept what these guys say, even though they're hundreds of years later. Doesn't make any sense. At the end of the day, it's just going to come down to accepting evidence and working off the evidence that we have. And it's again, like I say, it's a cumulative effect of evidence. It's not just one particular piece of data. It's not just one particular piece of evidence. It's not just one individual fact. It's the whole shebang. It's the total cumulative effect of all of the evidence combined that leads to the conclusion that Jesus rose again from the dead. We would not accept other testimonies like that because the other claims of other religions don't have the same kind of evidence. I don't see any reason when Matt I don't know. I'm sure this kind of argumentation that Matt's doing is going to sound very convincing to an atheist who really wants Matt to be right. And they're going to declare Matt the winner. All because they agree with Matt, he's an atheist, and it sounds reasonable to another atheist. If you accept these testimonies, why don't you accept these over here? Even though the ones over here are hundreds of years later. They don't have the same kind of evidence as the New Testament. Because the reality is that they're not on the same level of evidence. And that has to be dealt with. That has to be considered. That has to be thought through. Sitting there trying to say, oh, well, you accept the into one, you should accept the other, even if it's hundreds of years later, and this right here is close to the advance. It makes no sense. At the end of the day, we're going to accept the strongest testimony, the strongest evidence. That we're going to accept all, we're not going to just simply take something just because, we're just that way. Now, I'm a historian, so I'm going to look at the historical evidence. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. Let's continue.
The particulars of the case and the evidence that's presented. So in the case of the Quran, for example, and debated many Muslim scholars, in terms of the subject, in terms of the historiography of Jesus, which is what we're discussing today, the Quran claims in Surah 4, verse 157, Jesus was not crucified. And it says he was put on the cross by the Jews. At least that's the classical interpretation. Although there are other schools of thought that wouldn't agree with that, but that's at least the mainstream interpretation of that verse in Islam. And we have good evidence from the first century that Jesus really was crucified, even if you reject the resurrection. And so, and the Quran is really 600 years later, right? 610.
Is that evidence in the Bible or out of the Bible?
I'm afraid we've got to keep moving.
All right. The crucifixion has evidence both in the Bible and out of the Bible. That might be the reason why Matt's asking that, to see if Jonathan's just focused on the evidence in the Bible. Of course, that is still evidence, which here Matt doesn't appear to be denying it as evidence, but it does actually count as evidence too. But we also have evidence outside of the Bible for Jesus' crucifixion, such as Tacitus. I already quoted him earlier. We have Josephus, who also mentioned Jesus' death by crucifixion. We also have the Jewish Talmud, Marabar Serpion, and of course Lucian, who mentioned Jesus' crucifixion twice. And so, we have quite a bit. And of course, we have a number of Christian sources. I think I actually talked about the evidence of Jesus' crucifixion in another video. We got First Clement, for example. It's a first century source. We got other Christian sources that mention Jesus' crucifixion, that sort of thing. And of course, we have the New Testament as well. The four Gospels, the Pauline epistles. 7 of the 13 Pauline epistles are undisputed. 6 out of those 7 reference Jesus' crucifixion, and so forth. So it piles up as far as evidence goes. So the evidence for Jesus' crucifixion is quite strong. If you wonder where the conversation is among scholars, it's almost a non-issue. Almost all scholars. I think it's at like over 99.9%. So, you can look at less than 0.1% of scholars worldwide would deny that Jesus died by crucifixion. And very few historians would deny it. Very few scholars would deny it. It's almost a non-issue. The evidence is just way too strong for Jesus' crucifixion, death by crucifixion. Okay, let's continue.
A lot of questions left. We do have another one from Royce DeGaulle, maybe relevant in a super broad way. It says, is probability relevant at all after the fact of these alleged historical events?
No. As a historian, historians do work on probability. So Matt's answer is completely false. He gave it just kind of a simple no answer, but it's completely false. We're not doing statistical analysis, where you just kind of give the odds of what is likely for something to happen, and therefore, probability would make a whole lot of sense after the event. But in the case of a historical event, it does, because we're dealing with an event which we do not have personal knowledge of whether it occurred or not, except for the evidence through the sources that we're examining. In which case, then historians have different degrees of probability of what they would consider most likely to be true. Obviously, some things are so weakly evidenced that it has less likely to be true, and then other things are more probable than not. And there is even things that comes close to being almost absolutely certain. Of course, with historical events, you can never be fully absolutely certain. which is probably another reason why Matt takes so many anti-historical arguments, because he wants things proven in absolute terms, and you can't do that with historical investigation. So it must be frustrating for him. So he just kind of denies, the way historians do history, even though this is clearly the way in which they examine and evaluate the past. But so it is relevant. Probability is something that historians do when they assess probability of the past. All right, let's continue.
Gotcha. And Michael Dresden, thanks for your super chats. We're going to just roll this into one because they're basically, from what I gather, it's kind of the same idea. They said, Matt, you had said that claims are not evidence. And then they said some women claim that men have raped them. Do their claims count, or do their claims alone count as evidence, as well as Black people in the U.S. who have claimed that they've experienced racism? Does that, they say, do the claims alone count as evidence?
So I did an entire video about this distinction between claims and evidence. It's not that a claim cannot also be evidence for a proposition. I'm getting ready to do another video about this notion of extraordinary claims. But the question here isn't whether or not it should count as a data point. It's whether or not it should be sufficient to convince. And so the answer to that is essentially no. The mere fact that someone says something happened is not necessarily on its own conclusive enough to show that it did happen. What often happens is that these conversations end up derailing into something. Nobody wants to object to a person offering up their perception of their identity and saying, oh, should we accept that? Yes, because if the subject's about the identity. But if it's, what I'm saying is, if your claim is, in logic, we have proposition.
All right, before we get on the proposition part, I'm going to respond to this real quick. Okay, again, testimony counts as evidence. It does count as evidence. Now, here he's being inconsistent again. Now he's admitting that it is evidence in some way, but he's saying it's not enough to convince. I wish he would argue this the entire time. I wish the entire time he's debating, argue this, stop with the claims are evidence stuff, and just stick with this. And if he says, well, yeah, but I say claims are evidence, but I don't really mean that. I really mean this over here. Well, that's fine, then say this over here, because if that's what you mean. Because if you say claims does not count as evidence, then that is the argument that we're going to be looking at. This is something else. This is a different argument. This is a question of whether or not, if the evidence available, not denying its evidence, but whether it is sufficient to convince someone that something's true. And the answer is essentially yes, not no. If there is good reasons for thinking the testimony is good. Again, Jonathan is not arguing for total availability, neither am I, but Matt argues like we are. And of course, it also comes down to the epistemology. He thinks evidence can't be evidence unless it guarantees the proposition. But that's not what evidence is. Evidence is not a guarantee to the proposition. It is a support of it. It is basically something you're using as reasons to justify or to support the proposition at hand or conclusion.
And we don't simultaneously, we don't like address a question, which would have two possible answers or more. Instead, we have a proposition. Some God exists. This event happened. This is true. And that in and of itself is not evidence for the proposition that is being there. It is the proposition. The proposition itself is not evidence. And what Jonathan did, which I'm fine with, is that, the confidence that we have in the person who's presenting this, that factors in. And you're absolutely right. And the other thing that factors in is how consistent that claim is with the facts that we have of the world. If somebody says they were abducted and anally probed by an alien, that is a claim that requires something more than the claim. There are claims that we can just accept at face value because they are bolstered up by the mountains of evidence about the way the world works. If somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I just got a new puppy. Well, I know puppies are real and people have puppies. And so The problem is that we're bad at recognizing how much evidence we are attributing to the claim the instant we hear it.
All right. I let him speak for a little bit longer than necessary, but all right. What is a proposition exactly? A proposition is basically a conclusion, a judgment statement. Jesus rose again from the dead would be a proposition. Okay. No one claims that the conclusion or the proposition is the evidence. What we're claiming is that the testimony of the proposition at hand, not that Jesus rose again from the dead, but that the disciples said that they saw the raised Jesus, the risen Christ. That is the testimony of the disciples, and that counts as evidence of that specific point. Now, of course, it's combined with other stuff that leads to the conclusion Jesus rose again from the dead. It's not just that one little thing. Matt keeps on going from there to the conclusion. Like the fact that Jesus' disciples said they saw Jesus doesn't mean he rose from the dead. I'm not saying that. I don't think Jonathan is saying that. What Jonathan is doing is he's looking at the totality, the cumulative effect of all the evidence that we have on the resurrection, pointing to Jesus rising again from the dead. Not just the testimony of the disciples. It's an important part of the evidence, but it's not the only thing that we got. All right. Says Matt might be possibly confusing on the cumulative case, what cumulative case was, and the proposition is the conclusion. We're not claiming, okay, Jesus rose again from the dead, disciples said so, therefore Jesus rose again from the dead. We're not arguing that. That's not our argument. If Matt claims that's our argument, then he is strawmanning us. We're not claiming that. We are claiming that Jesus' disciples themselves testify to the risen Christ, and that is part of the case for the resurrection. It isn't the totality of it. It isn't all of it. All right. You mentioned background knowledge. The world, pretty relevant. I agree that background knowledge of the world would factor in to some degree or another, but it wouldn't be the only factor that would factor in. You would also factor the evidence in too. Interesting enough, William Lane Crabb's got this debate with Bart Ehrman where he presents this, and I think it's one of the best defenses against this, to be honest. I think William Lane Crabb gave the best defense possible on this. And he showed what the error was, even. And he did this by showing a type of way of determining probability. He doesn't use this way, but he just did that to show the factors involved and where the errors lie in the reasoning. But it's called the probability calculus. And he showed how that what's being considered is background knowledge alone without the evidence. If we consider background knowledge, the background knowledge alone without the evidence may be very, very low, but the evidence itself might be very, very high. And when combined with the background knowledge, it would increase the probability. What ends up happening is just saying, okay, because our background knowledge of the world is this, we're going to ignore the evidence to show differently, instead of combining that with the background knowledge of the world. Because even if the probability of something happening on the basis of your background knowledge itself is low, this would not mean this could be increased and effectively by the weight of the evidence, specific evidence for Jesus' resurrection from the dead. One of the reasons why I don't like this particular argument that Bart Ehrman likes to come up with is because it basically ignores evidence for sake of a naturalistic explanation of looking at, because your understanding of how the world works could be wrong. And we have to look at the evidence. And I'm not one of those people that believe that it's okay to ignore evidence, to dismiss evidence out of hand without rhyme or reason. I want to deal with the evidence. I want to deal with the arguments. I want to believe what is true, not what I think is true, not what is comfortable, not what fits my worldview, not what fits my little bubble of comfortability, but rather what is true. Even if that what is true opposes how I think. And again, background knowledge will play somewhat of a role in it, but we have to look at the evidence. Ignoring the evidence for the sake of background knowledge and looking only at the background knowledge ain't going to work. We have to look at the evidence too, because our background knowledge of the world could very well be wrong. This doesn't mean we might not, like Jonathan said earlier in this debate, ask a little bit more questions. And, if it's a miracle claim. But when it comes to when it comes to evidence, if we have enough evidence that Jesus rose again from the dead, and the evidence is very, very strong that Jesus rose again from the dead, then that's going to be enough to convince us if the evidence is good enough. Matt thinks it's not good enough because he thinks that no testimony, this is what he believes, that no testimony should ever rise to the level of convincing you of something, let alone someone rising again from the dead. That's what he believes. I disagree with that if the evidence is strong enough. The object of it is whether you're willing to put your worldview aside to look at the evidence. Let's continue.
When you hear a claim, you immediately say, is this claim consistent with the facts that I know about the world? And the more consistent the claim is with the facts, the less additional information you would need to provide. If you tell me, I just got a new puppy last night, I'm just going to take your word for it, because the worst thing that can happen is I find out that you're a liar or dishonest or wrong. And that's not going to fundamentally rewrite the world.
Again, background knowledge is not the only factor that plays a role in this. It does play a little bit. I agree with Matt. It plays some of a role, but you still have to look at the evidence too. The object of it, what Matt's suggesting is that if it denies what we think about the world, then either we need to reject it or have evidence that would not ever meet any historical criteria. Obviously, we have to have loads of physical evidence, DNA evidence, and none of that stuff is reasonable when it comes to historical studies. And we have to have all that stuff to believe it. But the object of it is that, one, we don't just have that as a piece of evidence. That's part of the case. And secondly, it's just not the case, because it forces us in a situation where we would ignore what the evidence says for our view or understanding of how the world works, which could be very well be wrong.
If instead you tell me there's a being who came down and died and was resurrected as some sort of substitutionary atonement for my wrongs against another facet of that same individual, you're going to have to come with more than a claim. And that doesn't mean that you come with multiple claims, because the plural of anecdote isn't data. And lining up a bunch of different people anonymously to say this is true doesn't mean all of a sudden we have a bunch more evidence. What we have are multiplying claims, not actual evidence. The evidence would be, hey, show me the empty tomb. I hear all my life, I keep hearing empty tomb, empty tomb. Oh, what's the proof of the resurrection? The empty tomb. There is no freaking empty tomb. There's a claim of an empty tomb. Nobody's ever demonstrated, here is the tomb where they put Jesus and now he's not here. That has never happened, and it can never happen unless there's a God that comes down and finds a way to do it. But Christians choose the shorthand. Oh, the empty tomb, the empty tomb. There is no empty tomb. Stop saying there's an empty tomb until you prove it. Produce the damn corpse. That's the issue with evidence.
All right. Again, I'll let him rant on. Lots and lots of errors here. All right. First off, the deity of Christ is a completely separate issue from Jesus' resurrection. I don't have to prove Jesus' deity at this point in time, because that has nothing to do with Jesus' resurrection. And of course, Matt claims he doesn't care about the how anyhow, so I don't know why he's even bringing that up. He made just theological inferences and things like that. None of that's relevant to Jesus' resurrection. All right. Matt, you notice Matt's denying multiple attestation. He says that the plural of antidote, what he means by antidote, he means written sources, is what he's talking about. He's saying multiple sources saying the same thing isn't data. Is that true? No, not at all. Multiple attestations. Again, he misunderstands multiple attestation to begin with, and then he denies what he misunderstands. Multiple attestation increases the probability, the likelihood that it's true. It doesn't guarantee the proposition. I know that's frustrating for Matt because that's part of his epistemology. He has to have a guarantee to him. But it increases the probability. It is data. It is evidence. It is considered evidence by historians. It's considered evidence by scholars. Granted, we don't have multiple sources for everything. And of course, a single source could still be believed. Most of our historical sources are single sources. We're not always fortunate enough to have multiple sources. So lack of multiple sources don't somehow decrease its probability that it's true. But multiple sources increases the probability, the likelihood that it's true. And that's what multiple attestation does. Matt appears to misunderstand that. They're not being lined up anonymously. How are they being lined up anonymously? First Corinthians is not anonymous. Peter and James is mentioned specifically in the creed. We know Paul got this creed from the disciples. We know who the disciples were. I don't see anything that's being presented anonymously. So where's Matt getting this stuff? Where are they anonymously giving this? We know where Paul got the creed. James and Peter are mentioned specifically, explicitly in the creed. Paul is named in 1 Corinthians. I mean, he identifies himself as Paul, the apostle. 1 Corinthians is one of the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul. Remember, I read Bart Ehrman's book, Forged to You, or read that passage from Forged. Clearly, this is, clearly written by Paul. So how's it anonymous? Existential fallacy. It is fallacious reasoning. It's also self-refuting and factually inaccurate. All right, he mentioned the empty tomb. We have evidence for the empty tomb. I've already talked about the evidence for the empty tomb. I'm not going to repeat that here, but we have pretty good evidence for the empty tomb. We do not have to produce a physical empty tomb. But the irony of it is that we do have a tomb that lots of scholars do think is actually the tomb of Jesus. And if you're wondering, no, there is no body in it. But there is a tomb. I think it's in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I think is what it's called, that is believed to be the tomb of Jesus. But we don't have to have the physical tomb to prove Jesus' tomb empty. We just need we just need sources that testify to it and evidence, in support of those sources and things like that. We don't have to have the physical tomb in front of us to know that. If we needed something physical to prove anything at all, then we wouldn't be able to prove just about anything in history. An empty tomb could be easily proven through historical methods and historical sources and historical evidence. That's how historians prove things. They don't do it through physical evidence because the vast majority of what we know from history comes from historical sources, from literary documentary sources that report them. And so we do have a report of the empty tomb. We do have evidence for the empty tomb. Matt claiming otherwise or denying it ain't gonna make it so. We do have evidence of an empty tomb. The last statement he made, this was a weird one. He said, produce the dang body. He even cussed with it. Question. Why would I need to produce a body to prove an empty tomb? Why would I need to produce a body to prove Jesus rose again from the dead? There will be no body. There would be no body in the empty tomb or in a tomb if the tomb was empty. In fact, if there was a body in the tomb, that would disprove the empty tomb. What the world? Why did he say that? I don't know. That was a weird statement. Prove the tomb is empty. Show me, produce the dang body. Produce it. There would not be a body in an empty, emphasis on empty tomb.
So I don't quite understand Matt's answer to that last question. So if a woman claims that she was raped, that's surely evidence she was. I agree that it's not proof that she was raped, but it's surely evidence, right?
No, it's the claim is not the evidence. Now, there's a bunch of things that we take into account with all of that, which includes the, what we know about that individual, any other physical data and everything else. But merely someone coming in and saying that they were sexually assaulted does not mean that you have reason to conclude that they are, because that in and of itself is not evidence.
Yes, it is. I have a question though. If it's not evidence, and it should be so obvious it's not evidence, the way Matt's supporters claim, then why does the entire legal system consider it evidence? Why does all historians consider evidence? Why do all scholars, and I'm talking about Christian and non-Christian, consider that evidence? Why does the vast majority of the world, and throughout the vast majority of the history of the world, at least in its written form, written language, considered testimony as evidence? And all of a sudden, Matt Dillahunty comes along and says, no, it isn't. And that's supposed to somehow shake the foundation of the human race and the history of the human race involving testimony as evidence. Bill Cosby was convicted on nothing but eyewitness testimony for something he did when he was a younger man. He's in jail. He's in prison right now over it. And you telling me it doesn't count as evidence? Now, what he probably is trying to say is that he don't think it counts as evidence because he cannot guarantee the proposition. But it's not intended to guarantee the proposition. That's not what evidence is. Evidence supports the proposition. It shows, it gives reasons to justify whether or not if the proposition is true or not. Obviously, the better the evidence and the more evidence we have, the more likely the proposition will be proven true. Now, doesn't guarantee it. There's always the possibility of mistakes, but it does create support for it. It does justify a sound reason for believing it. Even if Matt doesn't think so, doesn't make it not so.
Brian Stevens, thanks for your question, said, when someone says naturalism is a problem, wouldn't non-magicism be a problem too? Magic explains everything we have questions about just as well as the supernatural.
No, magic explains nothing. We explain things, we explain the unknown, the things that we don't understand. We explain those by appealing to things we do understand. You can't solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery. And let's not pretend that there's any explanatory power in how did I do this? And someone says it's magic, because there's zero explanatory power there.
All right. I think the question was actually intended for Jonathan. It might not. The guy might actually support Matt's arguments, but we're not actually claiming that Matt. This is a common straw man of Matt's, but we're not claiming magic rose Jesus from the dead. We're not claiming that magic did it or whatnot. What about this thing about appealing to a bigger mystery? He says that a lot during this debate. Okay, we're not appealing to a bigger mystery. Okay, we're appealing to what we know. We're using facts and evidence we actually have, and then we're using that to make the best explanation from that facts and evidences. We are not appealing to a bigger mystery. We're not appealing to any mystery, actually. Again, we're not saying it's magic, and something like that would lack explanatory explanatory scope. I agree with Matt, but that's not what we're arguing either. So I don't know if the questioner was arguing that or not, but we're not.
The Bothell guy, thanks for your question, said, Jonathan, Greek religion says that Dionysus rose from the dead. We have records of that in religious texts. Jonathan, did he raise? Because we have reports in their book. And Matt, let's see, can you point out the fallacies in the question for Jonathan? I think they meant maybe like the fallacies in like the charge of inconsistency that came up earlier in the debate. Jonathan, we'll give you a chance to respond to whether or not Dionysus rose from the dead.
All right. Let me let them respond real quick.
Yeah, so as I said, it's not just the fact that the resurrection is claimed in the New Testament, it's that we have, it's this particular nature of the claims. So just the fact that it's claimed in some ancient source that so-and-so rose from the dead, that doesn't really tell you anything. You have to look at, okay, are these sources which are credible historically, that they're substantially trustworthy? Are they close up to the facts? Are they habitually truthful and reliable sources of information? And do they go back to people who were eyewitnesses? And in the case of the resurrection, I think that we do have those. But in the case of Dionysus and figures in other religions, I do think that we do.
Gotcha. And J4,
I think I was just going to say that the only distinction that I can find is that one of the two stories became more popular and was spread more than another. That's the primary distinction, is that if more people had accepted the Dionysus thing, and well, also there's the notion of when more and more people began to write things down as opposed to just telling stories. There's a number of reasons why that's the case. But at the end, I will agree, there's a better case for the resurrection of Jesus than there's for Dionysus, just in the sense that there's more potential reports about it. But the question is, that's like saying I'm the smartest village idiot. It doesn't matter that you have more than a worse claim. The question is, do you have enough for this claim to be justified? Do you have strong evidence, which I clearly think today we have not seen strong evidence. But is it, even if you had strong evidence for the resurrection, that's still a separate issue from, do you have sufficient evidence to warrant accepting the resurrection?
Gotcha.
All right. Resurrection in Dionysus. There is no resurrection in Dionysus. The count doesn't exist. There is no resurrection in Dionysus. In fact, much of what is actually claimed by these conspiracy theorists about Dionysus is purely fabricated on the internet. Purely fabricated. Most of what you hear about it. Jonathan again is right. We have to look at the particulars of the case. It's not accepting something with your gullibility on your sleeve or something. What Matt says is false. There was a cult that was dedicated to Dionysus. Yeah, and it was actually a very popular cult among those that accepted that cult. So it isn't just because one became more popular, the other one is just not really that popular. This was very popular among those groups of people. Yeah. But that has nothing to do with it. Dionysus doesn't claim it. Nothing about Dionysus. All the sources that we have on Dionysus don't claim that Dionysus resurrected from the dead. That's purely fabricated. It's not the case. But again, like Jonathan said, we do look at the particulars of the case. We do have strong evidence. Matt might not think we have strong evidence, but we have strong evidence. We have it in the form of the testimony of the disciples, Paul, James. Combine this with other evidences: empty tomb, the origin of the Christian faith. The Christian church never came into being in the face of an occupied tomb, in the face of lack of Jesus' resurrection. I mean, the earliest Christians were Jews, but yet, the whole messianic movement should have stopped with Jesus' death, but it didn't. So we have other evidences to consider as well. But the evidence is very, very strong. What it is that Matt's epistemology says, one, evidence has to guarantee the proposition, and two, testimonies cannot count as evidence because they're claims, and he doesn't think claims should count as evidence, or if he's willing to admit it's evidence in any sense, he doesn't think it rises to the level of convincing you of anything, let alone a miracle. And that's just not the case. And of course, we could have supporting evidence in favor of the testimony as well, and that also has to be looked at. And he says he agrees with that, but then he will argue in a way that seems to suggest that he thinks that Jonathan is supporting total gullibility or something, and he's not. He's not arguing for that at all. And I agree that these questions are distinct. What he mentioned is distinct from whether it's actually true. I agree with that. I mean, there is a distinction between that. But when you look at all the various specifics and evidence you have and supporting evidences and the totality of it, eventually it will lead to a conclusion that Jesus or that the truth of the testimony that's being proclaimed. And again, testimony counts as evidence. Matt might not believe it. Matt could shake his head, say no, do a debate review video on my debate review, and say nope, doesn't count. Okay. The fact that Matt Dillahunty says so don't make it the case. It is universally recognized as evidence.
Also, Jake 4D, thanks for your claim. They said claims are evidence. They just happen to be better evidence for someone making a claim than the event itself. Still evidence is just weak evidence. I think they're challenging your position on claims and evidence, Matt.
Okay, I have $1 million. Is that evidence? They're not going to answer. It doesn't matter.
Gotcha.
There's a difference between a mere assertion type claim versus a testimony. A testimony is what you're testifying to what actually took place. Like if I said that my child drew on the sidewalk, that's a testimony because I saw him do it and I'm testifying that that's the case. Now, other factors might be looked into it, whether I'm likely to have lied, am I, habitually truthful, like Jonathan talked about. Do I the kind of person who typically makes up some kind of practical joke, or just like for fun, make you believe something that's not true or something of that nature? Or, am I usually very accurate about that? I wouldn't kid around with my son when it comes to my son doing something like that, that sort of thing. You might look at other factors, but it counts as evidence. Does it guarantee the proposition? No, there's always possibility of lying. There's always possibility of joking around. There's always possibility of mistakes. Maybe I thought that he did. Maybe I saw somebody else. There's always that kind of thing that could happen. It doesn't guarantee the proposition, but the testimony itself is still considered evidence. Matt doesn't think it is. Doesn't make it this case. Now, what Matt likes to do is he likes to throw up mere assertions, because there are different kinds of claims, right? And these claims aren't considered evidence. They're just kind of just speculative, wild things that they're just throwing out there, but they're not actually people saying, hey, I saw this event take place. Rather, instead, they're saying, well, I've got a pink elephant in my room downstairs. Okay, that's a mere assertion, not a testimony. There's a difference. There's a distinction. It's a mere assertion, not a testimony. It would not constitute as evidence to begin with, one, because it's a mere assertion. Okay. Two, I know you're fibbing about it because of the context of the situation. Because you're trying to make a point and you're not making, and you're throwing that out there. So, I mean, with a testimony, the implied assumption is simply that the person is presenting something that they're presenting as true. It doesn't make it true, Doesn't guarantee that it's true, but they're at least presenting it as true. Okay? Obviously, if Matt says he has a pink elephant downstairs, he's not presenting it as true. He's just presenting it as an example to try to make a point. That's not the same as a testimony. It would not be the same as evidence. And Matt conflates the difference. In his analogies, he often conflates the difference. All right. Let's continue.
And let's see. John Robertson, thanks for your question, said, what historical evidence for the resurrection would you consider necessary and sufficient to compel belief? I think that, I don't know who it's for. If you guys have a guess.
I suspect it's from Matt.
I do too. And my answer is, I don't know. I don't have any other resurrection claims to compare it to. It's like saying, hey, here's something that you have no evidence for, that's never occurred in reality in an identifiable way. What sort of evidence would convince you of it? I don't know. What sort of evidence would convince someone of a black hole? At the point where black holes were just speculative, I'm not even sure that the people who were talking about it could have identified, here's the evidence we need. But when the evidence appears and is presented, and there's a demonstrable causal connection tie between the evidence and the claim, that's when it becomes compelling. To pretend that I need to have an understanding of everything that would convince me about everything right now in epistemology is asinine. What I need is to be open to becoming convinced. And my question throughout this entire thing has been that if I were to accept the New Testament account, what accounts would I have to accept? How far will I have lowered my standards of evidence so that I would have to also accept competing claims? And I think it's just a laundry list of crap.
Gotcha.
All right. Lots of errors here. And the only crud here, Matt, is everything you just said. All right. Let's get to discuss Matt. Okay. Matt has an unreasonable standard of evidence. He wants physical evidence. He wants of historical events. He wants DNA evidence. He wants blood samples. I mean, yeah, he has this idea of what kind of evidence would convince him, and it's all stuff that can't be used to prove anything in history. But yet we're talking about historical event, something that happened in the past, but he wants standards of evidence that can never be used in the past for anything. It's an unreasonable standard of evidence. He sets it up that way. He knows he doesn't know it's unreasonable. He thinks it's reasonable, but it's not reasonable. It wouldn't be lowering your standard of evidence, Matt, if you listen to this. It would not be lowering your standard of evidence. The evidence for the resurrection is very, very good, and it obviously beats anything that we have from ancient history. But the standards of evidence that you're having is unreasonable. It's irrational. You set your standard up in a way where nothing can prove it to you. You said what you need to be is open to the evidence. Oh, I agree. Open to being convinced. That's what you need. Absolutely. The problem is you're not open to being convinced. You're not open to being convinced at all. They mentioned black holes, evidence for a black hole. All right. We can't actually see a black hole per se. All we can see is evidence for a black hole. How do we know a black hole is there? By the evidence. We can make a reasonable inference from the evidence, which is how they make reasonable inferences today. That's how they know. You can't see a black hole. It pulls all light in on all of our eyesight, lenses, telescopes, everything is based on light. And if gravity is so strong that it pulls light into it, we can actually see a black hole. What we see is kind of an empty space where matter is circling around it. We can see evidence of a black hole, and then we can make a reasonable inference from that evidence. So I think a black hole analogy was a perfect analogy. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work the way that Matt intended it. Of course, testimonies of the evidence that he's ignoring. I already mentioned he needs to be open-minded, definitely. Of course, Matt, there toward the end, is committing the slippery slope fallacy. If I accept one, I have to accept the other. No. The standards of evidence, again, Matt, you're not lowering your standards of evidence. What is going on is you're setting your standards of evidence up in a way that nothing can be able to pass it. The evidence for Jesus' resurrection isn't the same as what we have for the Quran 600 years later, or Buddhism 500 years later, or Muhammad, miracles of Muhammad, all of his miracles in his biography 125, 150 years later, or Apollonius of Tyana's miracles in Philostratus's work in the early to mid 3rd century, over 100 years after Apollonius of Tyana lived. Yeah, the evidence for the New Testament, far better. It isn't just because it has multiple sources. It has that, but it also has early sources. So yeah, it's not lowering your standard of evidence. What you're doing is you're trying to lower the New Testament standard of evidence that it actually has in its favor to these other religions. And it's just not the same.
And John Robertson, thanks for your question, said, Joseph Smith versus Paul, how do you distinguish between who is lying, honestly mistaken, or telling the truth? I think that's for you, John.
How do you distinguish between someone who is lying, mistaken, honestly, or telling the truth? Through the methods that I outlined in my opening statement, I gave arguments. So that's what my whole opening statement was about, was providing. And it's not that it's that each of the individual lines of evidence are proof positive in my rejection of each of these alternative hypotheses, but rather they provide evidence. And if we add more and more evidence, provides more and more support that confirms the falsity of the alternative hypotheses, namely the myth hypothesis, the conspiracy hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis. And therefore, since that redistributes the probabilities, that supports in turn the resurrection hypothesis.
Gotcha. Ethan, this is an interesting one. Ethan Montier, thanks for your question. Said, thanks, Matt, for the years and years of reasoning we spoke about a year ago. And when was the last time you heard a truly unique argument after so long? And do you have a pre/post debate routine?
I don't know that I've ever heard anything that's truly new or unique. I mean, most of it seems to be derivative, and that's not a problem because so even someone like Psy, Psy's big benefit or credit is that he's consistent. He's consistently wrong as far as I'm concerned, but he's consistent. And so while I haven't heard anything new in a debate, there's always a new, different spin on old things. And I like having the conversations. There was a second part to this question, but I don't remember what it was now.
Gotcha.
What was the last line of the...
Oh, do you have a pre and post debate routine?
No, today took a shower, shaved, put on a shirt, played guitar for a little bit, then came...
You got it, and thanks.
All right. I'm gonna treat the question like it's geared to me here. Have I ever, experienced a truly unique argument? The vast majority of the arguments I usually hear are usually the same arguments I've heard 1,000 times over. Most of them. Every now and then, someone will throw up an argument that I have never heard. A lot of times they're just things that people are popping off the top of their heads or something of that nature, but they do throw up a unique argument. There's a woman, an atheist, that was debating recently, still debating, and she made a wild accusation about the Old Testament and the Hebrew, and claiming that the earliest manuscript probably was in the Vatican, and that's probably the earliest manuscript that we have, or something of that nature. And I said the only manuscript that we actually have that's in the Vatican, it's in the Vatican Library, is Codex Vaticanus, which contains the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. And the earliest actual manuscripts that we have of the Hebrew is the Dead Sea Scroll, which is a matter of common knowledge. And, it was found to be amazingly accurate to the previous earliest Hebrew manuscripts we had, which was the Mosaic text. I also told her that because she was accusing the Roman Catholics of doctoring it, I said Roman Catholics had nothing to do with the copying, distribution, or preservation of the manuscripts in question. In fact, no Christian did, because the Old Testament that I have is substantially equal to the Hebrew scriptures, which the Jews called the Tanakh. It was the Jews that copied it, distributed it, and circulated it, and it circulated among the Jews and that sort of thing. So no Christian had anything to do with doctoring it. That's just completely inaccurate. So sometimes people will throw up something like that that's unique, that's never before. But usually when they do throw up something unique, it's usually something off the top of their head. It's some factual inaccuracy based on how they view things,
Next up, Dominic Huber, thanks for your question, said, if you write a dogmatic book about your religion, would you write about your witnesses to be trustworthy, or would you claim that they are a fraud?
Not sure who that's for. I guess we could both answer it.
If you want.
Yeah, it's just an question, because I'm not arguing that the gospel authors are reliable because they claim to be reliable. Of course, that would be an absurd argument. And I'm claiming that there's good evidence that they're reliable because on the points that we can cross-check, they actually themselves to be close up to the facts and get a lot of information correct, which then provides a fantastic reason for trusting them even in those instances that we cannot directly cross-check.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And within, like in magic, there's this notion of a too perfect theory. Like, James, if I were to ask you to name any card in the deck of cards, what would you name?
The Jack of Spades.
The Jack of Spades. Now, if in fact I were sitting here holding a card off to the side and moved it over in there, and it happened to be the Jack of Spades, that trick would fall flat because of the too perfect symbol. Ooh, I don't see the green screen. It's too perfect that you named a card and it happened to be the card I was holding. And so it leads directly to what the solution is. When it comes to what we like and what we admire, we like symmetry, but we don't like perfect symmetry. A perfectly symmetrical face is somehow a disturbing or off-putting to us. It seems completely unsurprising to me that people, when telling a story, that they're willing to exaggerate or engage in a little hyperbole, etc. We know from a child, from the time that you're starting to interact with other children, you learn how to tell stories in such a way that people find them more compelling. And the stories need flaws. Otherwise, it's just too perfect. And so it's hardly unsurprising to me that there would be flaws in the story we're talking about. Flawed human beings.
All right. I like Matt's magic analogy. When I was a little kid, I used to be very big on magic and magic tricks. I liked it. I used to read books on the subject matter. And if me and Matt got together, I'm sure we'd have a good old conversation about it. I'd like to know a lot of stuff that he does with magic. And so I like his analogy. I like his, his thing, but, I don't really see it as being that relevant to it. But I'm not that. It sounds to me like Matt is justifying an appeal to possibility fallacy. It's possible that they could be wrong. And he's saying, well, it's just too perfect for them not to be wrong. So it's likely for them to be wrong. And the reality of it is that's just not the case. It doesn't. The fact that someone's possible that they could be wrong does not mean that they are wrong. You have to be able to prove that they're wrong. You have to show evidence that they're wrong. You have to, or at least go to the evidence that we have that they're right, and disprove that at least. Simply the fact that it's possible that they could be wrong isn't enough to prove that they're wrong. It isn't enough to be considered, because if it's possible that they can be wrong, then it's also possible they can be right. The fact that I can be wrong about something doesn't prove that I am. It doesn't provide any evidence in here. Now, if Matt gets over this, he'll probably say, "Oh, well, I'm not really saying that," but it's your argument that I'm evaluating. Whether you would say that in a typical statement or not makes no difference to me. I'm only evaluating what you're actually arguing. And what you're arguing is implying that if it's possible that they could be wrong, then it's probable that they could be wrong, which is a fallacious argument. Let's move on.
Gotcha. And question from Ian Utublin said, Dr. Jonathan, could the Gospels have a Mandela effect?
No, because there's no such thing.
What does he mean by the Mandela effect? That's not actually the term I'm familiar with.
Even after reading about it twice, I still am not sure if I understand it.
Basically, the Mandela effect, which isn't a real thing, is something that they've labeled where people will remember bits of history differently. Like, here's a picture of Tiananmen Square with somebody standing in front of a tank, and they'll remember different details of it differently. Or is it the Berenstain Bears or the Berenstain Bears or whatever else? And the truth is that there's not a real thing there. It's not. Well, all we're really saying is that people have flawed memories.
Gotcha.
All right. I agree with Matt Dillahunty on the Mandela effect. I haven't done a whole lot of research about it. I don't really know that much about it, to be honest. Before I saw this debate, I've never heard that term myself, like Jonathan. But I did get this get brought up to me by someone I'm debating. I'm debating two people right now in the comment section of one of my videos on this. They're debating back and forth. It's a friendly debate. I mean, we're not, getting disrespectful with one another or nothing like that. But one of those persons brought up the Mandela effect, and I mentioned it to him that Matt Dillahunty actually said in this debate that it was not an actual thing per se. It's just, people have, bad memories, or it's not really a question of remembering something different as much as it is just, poor memories or whatnot. But I think the major problem is it doesn't take in consideration the way oral cultures was and the way they pass along information and remember details, because they're, repeating it. They got creeds and hymns that were memory aids. And of course, repetition is a memory aid as well. They were training the members to remember large amounts of information. I mean, in this culture, they were, taking tomes like the Homer's Iliad and committing it to memory. So that's the kind of culture we're talking about here, and it's passing this information along. So those kinds of things have to be taken into consideration.
But next up, let's see. Michael Simonelli, thanks for your question, says, how does Jonathan know that the claims he's using to assert the biblical figures are trustworthy are true?
I'm not quite sure I understand that question. I'd already outlined that. I think that there's there are 19 categories of evidence which cumulatively bear on the substantial trustworthiness of the gospel accounts, including undesigned coincidences, extra-biblical corroborations, unexplained allusions, oral similarities, and so forth, expressive silence. And though we don't have time to get into all those, I think the argument is that cumulatively those provide substantial support for the general reliability of the gospel accounts. And therefore, when the gospels assert something to be true, that provides a basis for trusting that to be true, even if we don't have direct evidence for that particular fact, and unless there's evidence to the contrary, of course.
Yeah, I think the objection here, if I'm going to try to interpret what they're asking, is that on several occasions, including just now, I've heard Jonathan say extra biblical evidence, extra biblical support, and yet there's nothing about his case that was extra biblical at all.
Gotcha.
All right. What Jonathan just was talking about here is extra biblical support for the proclamation of the Gospels, and we do have evidence outside the New Testament for that, such as historical sources that confirm a lot of the events in the Gospels. We got historical evidence. We even have archaeological evidence outside of the New Testament and things like that. and for that, even providing physical evidence. He's just talking about confirming, because that's what the questioner was asking, confirming whether or not they're telling the truth, whether what they're stating was true, and that sort of thing. As far as the case for the resurrection specifically, Matt claimed, or Jonathan claimed, that he didn't have no evidence outside of the Bible for it, but I showed you there is evidence outside the Bible. Tacitus and Josephus, two non-Christian sources, they mention it. We also have a number of Christian sources I never even brought up, like Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius. Of course, these people can testify what the disciples were saying, but anyway, there's the Christian evidence in favor of the testimony of it. And of course, we have the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed, even though it's in 1 Corinthians, so it's biblical in a sense, but it's also extra biblical in a sense because it doesn't originate with Paul. Paul didn't invent the creed when he was writing 1 Corinthians, so it exists apart from 1 Corinthians. So it would count as extra biblical evidence in that sense. Probably not enough to convince Matt, and probably not even enough to Matt even consider it extra biblical, but it is extra biblical evidence in that sense. Okay, let's continue.
And thanks for your question. This one comes in from, let's see, I'm going to paraphrase this, Michael, because it's just, a lot of it's kind of redundant from a last question, but it's like a follow-up. They said, for Matt, they said, if claims being evidence is context dependent, then isn't it true that claims can be evidence?
No, it's not the claim that's the evidence. It's the context that's the evidence.
Got it.
I don't know why this is any different. Here, let me do it differently. A proposition is never evidence. Maybe that's a distinction we need to make. But when Jonathan hears someone making a claim, what he hears is someone of this character in this setting with these factors made this proposition. And he's adding those things in as evidence for the proposition, the character of the person. Maybe that's it. Maybe, but I could be wrong, because if I say propositions aren't evidence, for all I know, Jonathan's going to say, yes, they are. I don't know.
All right. Some types of claims, such as testimonial claims, that's counted evidence. Propositions are not the same as testimonies, because propositions has to do with judgments or conclusions. It's like if I say Jesus rose again from the dead, that's a proposition. Okay. Now that's a thing that needs to be proved. So I'm not arguing for that, because that would be circular. Rather, instead, I have evidence, and then that evidence points to that proposition, points to that conclusion. And so I would say Jesus rose again from the dead because we have this evidence that shows that that's the case. He's denying testimony, but he seems to be conflating that testimony with propositions, which is not the same thing. Let's continue.
Definitely. Let's see. We only have just maybe two more. Thank you, Red Knight 821 said, why would the disciples preach a lie for no reason and have the Romans hate them? Why would the early Christians start a religion that would get them killed?
Why would anybody start a religion that might get them killed? Do you think Christianity is the only religion that was persecuted or treated harshly by the people in the surroundings? That's such a flawed line of reasoning. There's nothing else to say.
Oh, there's plenty to say. It's not flawed line of reasoning. Not to argue it the way in which it's actually presented. The disciples had nothing to gain and everything to lose if they were wrong. I know Matt isn't accusing the disciples of dishonesty, but there are people that question whether they lie or not. Matt's not accusing them of lying, but he brings it up occasionally, the possibility they could have lied. The fact of the matter is that if they were lying about it, they knew that they were lying about it. They started a religion that they knew that it was false, and they went to the graves proclaiming a religion they knew was false. They suffered hardships. Apostle Paul gave a whole laundry list of situations in which he had gone through including beatings, shipwrecks, all sorts of things. And yet, if they're making up an entire religion, again, I know Matt's not accusing you of making it up, but like I said, he does throw that possibility out there. If they're making up an entire religion and they knew it was false, they wouldn't have gone through their deathbeds proclaiming it. They would have backed out of it, basically. They wouldn't be Christians anymore. Because why would they do that knowing that it is false? Knowing that it's false. They were in a position to know whether what they believed or what they were claiming is true or not. You know, if they saw the risen Jesus. So yeah, it's not flawed reasoning at all. It's understanding that because of the disciples, the situation, they would not have likely to have lied or made this up, given that those circumstances. It's not just because they were persecuted and there's other religions that have been persecuted. They were in a position to know for a fact whether what they said was true or not. They didn't have anything gained from it. They had a lot to lose, and they faced all kinds of sufferings and hardships, and continued to believe in something they knew was false because it would ultimately end up getting them killed. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, that alone is logically fallacious argument.
Gotcha.
All right. Again, thank you for watching this debate review series I did. I'm going to switch it over to the closing argument, and we will end not only this video, but this entire series. Thank you. Well, it took a long time, but we're finally here. We're finally at the end of this debate review series. I have enjoyed making this debate review. I do plan on making more videos like this. I plan on taking up James on his offer to do some more debates on his debate reviews on his channel. And but I enjoyed this debate, and I enjoyed this debate review. I would love to hear what you think in the comment section of the debate and of the debate review itself, and of the arguments that they brought forward, the arguments I brought forward, my responses, their responses. Let me know in the comments what you think. I might respond to some of y'all as well. I got lots of people that like to debate me because I'm a Christian apologist, and I'm a scholar, and I know this stuff, and and there's always someone that thinks they have the truth and they know the truth, and you're being irrational, and they try to debate me and dispute what I'm arguing all the time. But unfortunately, I don't have time to debate everybody. I just don't have that much time on my hands. But there's a few, that if I think is relevant enough, I might respond back to it and reply. But overall, I like the debate. I do not like how Matt Dillahunty dismisses the evidence. I'll talk more about that in a minute. To me, part of the benefit of the purpose of the debate is to flesh out issues and arguments and evidence, and you can't do this with someone dismissing everything someone brings to the table without rhyme or reason, just because you don't like it, you don't agree with it, it doesn't fit your worldview, all sorts of reasons that are not rational, that do not give a good reason or rationale for why you reject it. And Matt has a tendency to do that. And for me, that's a huge issue. And I'll talk more on his dismissal arguments in a minute. Who do I think won this debate? All right. In the comment sections, there are all kinds of mixed opinions. Obviously, the Christians will think Jonathan won. Obviously, they just think Matt won. And I think most of the people that comment to these kinds of discussions and debates don't actually understand the way in which debates are won or lost. You base it on the weight of the argument, you base it on the evidence, and you base it on the kind of reasoning they employed, and it is kind of like an overall evaluation of the debate. There's always some give and take, times when, Matt might be right and times when Jonathan might be right, and some gray areas in between, there are those kinds of things. But I don't think debates are won or lost based on which worldview I just happen to agree with. I don't think debates are won or lost based on whether this is your favorite person to agree with and that sort of thing. I don't think truth is a popularity contest, and I certainly don't think the victor of a debate should be a popularity contest. And when looking at a debate, you don't determine the debate based on how many points did the person make. They both are going to make points. Okay, Matt's going to make a few points. Jonathan's going to make a few points. They're going to go back and forth. This is part of a debate because this is one way in which you try to flesh out issues that you have. But that's not what wins a debate. What does win a debate? Arguments, evidence, good reasoning, and it's overall. It's not, like I said, there's times when Jonathan's going to be wrong. There's times when Matt's going to be wrong. There's times when they're both going to be wrong. There's times when they're both going to be right. And of course there's some gray areas too where, it go either way. It's a little bit more disputed, that sort of thing. But overall, I thought Jonathan had the strongest arguments. He didn't dismiss anything that Matt brought to the table without rhyme or reason. Now, some of the atheists in the comment section probably will say, well, jump on this and say, well, he dismissed other religions without rhyme or reason. No, he didn't. Matt did not let him actually explain. He was trying to explain what he meant, and Matt kept interrupting and refusing to let him explain. That was right before Jonathan had left. So he was trying to explain what he meant. He wasn't talking about rejecting other religious claims. The other religious claims don't have the same level of evidence that the New Testament has. And that's just a fact. I mean, just compare it. You got early information inside the New Testament. You got multiple attestation. Early creeds. I mean, you don't have that kind of stuff in, say, the Quran or the Buddha scriptures or all that stuff. You don't have that same kind of information. You don't have the same kind of evidence. But Matt wants him to go on the slippery slope. If you accept Jesus' resurrection, you must accept these other religious claims too, because after all, they don't have no better evidence. Which he's actually just trying to bump the New Testament down to the level of other religions, and you can't do that because the evidence for the New Testament is far better and far superior. He often threw up bogus analogies. He had some false analogy fallacy. He made the existential fallacy. That's another major problem I had with Matt's argument. His distinction between claims and evidence. This is something that a lot of people have a problem with. It's not just me. Jonathan voiced he had a problem with it. Matt Winger voiced he had a problem with it in their debate. And it's a distinction that nobody else makes. Okay, some types of claims don't count as evidence. But some types of claims, such as testimonial claims, count as evidence. This is what Jonathan was arguing. He wasn't arguing all claims count as evidence. He was arguing that some claims count as evidence. More specifically, testimonial claims, or also known as testimonials. People that testified to an event that had happened. That constitutes as evidence. Now, you can have supporting evidence, because that's what historians call it, supporting evidence, supporting that particular thing. But that doesn't mean that particular thing is not evidence. It's still evidence. You seem to conflate propositions and premises and like individual facts and evidence. and he would conflate that with a proposition. And propositions are basically judgments, conclusions, things like that. He seemed to be not fully understanding a cumulative case argument, or at least he didn't quite get it. And in doing so, it does appear that he might not either understand an inductive argument or argue in a way that made it look that way to Jonathan. Probably because I don't think he understood a cumulative case, or at least he didn't get it. I'm not saying he doesn't know what a cumulative case argument. I'm not calling him stupid or something. I understand that if he defined it, maybe he could define it correctly. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt on all this. What I'm saying here is that on the basis of the way in which he argued, okay, it appears based on that he didn't seem to get it. He didn't seem to get the concept, the way in which he argued. I'm not saying that he doesn't get it. I'm saying he argued in a way that made it look that way. That's what I'm saying. There is no doubt in my mind that Jonathan had the stronger argument. What Matt brought to the table was what he usually brings to the table, a dismissal argument, where he dismissed everything that Jonathan was saying without rhyme or reason. He dismissed all the evidence that he brought to the table because he didn't believe testimony counts as evidence, which of course he bounced back and forth on that inconsistently, mind you. One minute he'll say it's not evidence, the next minute he'll say, oh yeah, it's evidence, but it's not enough. It's not enough to convince. But through most of this debate, he argued that it doesn't count as evidence. So in doing so, when he said claims not evidence, he was making the existential fallacy in logic. All claims are not evidence. All testimonies are claims. Therefore, some types of claims, such as testimonials, are not evidence. But it is evidence. Now, that's if he argues that. If he argues the other thing, because he kept bouncing back and forth, then he's not committing the existential fallacy at that point. But he is still making a self-refuting argument either way. Because someone can easily say that, and I say that claims, or your claim that claims are not evidence is also a claim. And he says, well, I'm not claiming that claims are not evidence. I'm claiming that claims cannot rise to the level of convincing something. Well, then your statement is a claim that cannot rise me to the level of being convinced that your claim that claims are not evidence is true. You see how that can quickly shoot Matt in the foot as a result. He tried to accuse Jonathan of a self-refuting argument. Well, it wasn't a self-refuting argument because Jonathan's argument was not all claims are evidence. He acknowledged there are some types of claims that are not evidence. The problem is that Matt was taking a broader terminology such as claims, which is much more complex because there are different kinds of claims, and trying to generalize it to say all claims are not evidence. And Jonathan's saying, no, it's much more complex than that. Certain types of claims can count as evidence. It is Matt that was making the existential fallacy. It was Matt that was making the self-refuting argument. It was Matt who was stating the factual inaccuracy because testimony is always being considered evidence. And it was just an excuse to dismiss every bit of the evidence that Jonathan brought forward. And so I did not find, as usual, that Matt's arguments were very convincing. He seemed like he was just dismissing everything that Jonathan brought to the table. And as usual, Matt was trying to rely heavily on his rhetorical ability. And that's another thing. Some people think that rhetoric wins a debate. Matt is good rhetorically. He has good rhetorical ability. I'll admit that. The way he weaves rhetorical devices like analogies, the way he articulates his arguments, the way he just kind of responds right there on the spot. He obviously doesn't prepare much because I think he leans a lot on his rhetorical ability. So, but with that said, rhetoric doesn't win the debate. Why do I say that? Because rhetoric is a person's ability, their skill with their ability to articulate words and arguments for the purpose of convincing. It is not the arguments themselves, and it's not evidence. It's their ability. And if you're basing on whether Matt won or not, think about what you're saying. You're saying that Matt won because he was a good debater. That's essential what you're saying. And that can't be what we're basing on truth. That cannot be what we're determining the who was right and who was wrong. That can't be what we're determining who was more convincing. It has to be the arguments that we're looking at. When someone determines that someone won a debate because they had good rhetorical ability, they have not even bothered looking at the arguments. Because the argument is what that we evaluate. The argument is what convinces us. The argument is what we draw conclusions from and how we evaluate debates. This is why I said Matt lost, because he didn't bring any evidence to the table. He could probably get out of that by saying, well, the title of the debate was strong evidence, and so all I had to do was convince that there was no strong evidence, that sort of thing. He could probably get out of that for that. But he did make some dogmatic assertions during the debate, which would require him to present evidence, such as claiming that Paul wasn't present at Jesus' crucifixion. Okay, what evidence does he have for that? None. He tried to argue from silence. That's another thing. He had tons of logical fallacies in it. I mean, I found slippery slope fallacy, existential fallacy. You got the argument from silence, ignatum argumentum, or ad ignatum argumentum, argument from ignorance, which is an argument from silence. All sorts of fallacies he kept making throughout the entire debate. Strawmanning, he kept misrepresenting his position. Notice Jonathan kept saying that he wasn't supporting total gullibility. He wasn't saying that the disciples said it, I'm just going to take their word for it. That's not what he was arguing. And he said that explicitly throughout the entire debate, from the beginning all the way to the end. And Matt kept making it sound like he was supporting total gullibility. If you accept these, why don't you accept this over here? And that's not what Matt was doing, or Jonathan was doing. So you got, tons of misrepresentation, straw man. You got factual errors. You got all kinds of other logical fallacies, slippery slope fallacy. I mean, his reasoning was terrible. Matt was. Not Matt himself. I'm not calling Matt terrible. I'm saying his reasoning was terrible. His arguments were bad, and they were highly unconvincing to me. Again, I'm not saying anything bad about Matt. Nothing. I'm talking about his arguments. His arguments were not good. And in contrast to Jonathan's arguments was right on point. He presented evidence. He cited sources. He gave information. I don't remember finding any logical fallacies in any of the arguments that was presented by Jonathan McLatchie. I know that Matt accused him of a couple, including the circular argument, with trying to come up with an explanation, but that's not a circular argument. To want to explain the data that we got is not a circular argument. Matt just worded it the way a certain way to make it sound that that's what Jonathan was arguing. But Jonathan was not arguing that. So my overall conclusion is this. Matt Dillahunty lost this debate. I know a lot of atheists is going to disagree with me. A lot of atheists think he probably won. But that's because they don't know how to evaluate debates. And a lot of them that I've seen in the comment section would declare him the winner simply because he had the better rhetorical ability. Which, by the way, you can actually hone through experience. And he has lots of experience debating. But that's not how that's not how debates should be judged or evaluated. We should look at the arguments, and his arguments were terrible. They were not very good arguments. He often had logical fallacies throughout them. His reasoning was flawed. He often stated factual inaccuracies. He rejected certain historical methodologies like multiple attestation, criteria of embarrassment, and others, and he clearly didn't approach this like a historian. That's for sure. And my philosophy is, if you approach something that pertains to something in the past, you take upon yourself the role of the historian. And if you're taking upon yourself the role of the historian, then it just makes sense consistently to apply the same kind of standards and methodology they did. And he wasn't. He was even applying an unreasonable standard. He wanted things like DNA, blood work. You know, he wanted a body produced for an empty tomb, which made no sense, since if there was a body in an empty tomb, that would disprove the empty tomb, not prove it. Things like that. Well, anyway, we reached the end. We reached the end of this debate review. I am going to do more debate review, either series or individual videos. If I can, I might try to get like one video and just show a few scenes in there that I want to approach on the overall review, so I don't have to do it in several videos like this. But I hope you enjoy this debate. I hope you enjoy this debate review. I will be doing more debate reviews in the future. I'm probably going to move on to some other stuff, other videos that I'm going to have planned up. And please like and subscribe. If you're not subscribed already, get subscribed. That way you can be able to it make it easier to access my videos as well. And of course, hit that notification bell. All right, that notifies you when a new video come available. I make a lot of videos. I don't do it every day, but I do it every week. Sometimes it's just once a week. A lot of times it does end up getting multiple videos a week, because especially if I'm doing a series. And hitting the notification bell allows you to be notified whenever I receive a video or a new video out. You will get notified of it. Don't forget to hit that like subscribe button, because that helps with the YouTube algorithm. And I want this information to get out to people. I want it I want this video to stand out to people and for people to respond. And don't forget to tell me what you think in the comment section. I want to hear from you. I really do. I might have a discussion with you about a few issues you might have, or if you just want to make a comment. Tell me if you like it or don't like it. Tell me what you think of the debate. Tell me what you thought of this debate review series. By all means, let me know in the comment section. Again, like I said, please like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell. And I will see you on the next one. And also, I want to leave you with this one point. Remember, always learn the facts that the critics don't want you to know. Thank you.